days there were a lot of youth clubs, and it was great, and I've even spent a few years working as a youth worker. But he did work with the Nasher crew in the very early days, and people like Gessi and Shoaib from Osmani. You know, there was this youth centre called Woods here, not far, I think it was about halfway down Brick Lane. I'm not sure if it's there anymore. But he was really eager to share this knowledge around music production with the younger generation and totally encouraged them. So after he passed away, sometimes I've got phone calls from Nasher and Osmani saying, "Oh, we're just ringing you because we want to hear your opinion." And I'm like, "No, you're ringing me because you can't ring him," which is fine. Yeah. But and I think that for Sam's son, who is called Sage and he lives in the US, is a beautiful legacy, not only for his child but for all of us. That you know that his influence, his passion for teaching, his passion for helping others, his passion for like teaching music lives through Nasher, and hopefully it will continue to pass through to other generations as it goes.
I mean, it already has. Like, we at Daytimers had an event with Nasher, and it was like just like a current generation meets slightly previous generation, but then Nasher's sound obviously also being influenced through all the sounds, but it's just like this like decade-long like experience in the sonics that were being played, and it's really, really special, and like it just speaks to the legacy that's been left and will continue to, I think, inspire going forward. So yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I was able to talk part in like the inspiration behind following your art form. I think I guess it can be like quite an emotional question, but speaking also to anytime I get to speak to anyone that was involved in the original scene, and also sort of talk about how like crazy a time it was, and then whenever it is that Sam's brought up, it's just like this instant like outpouring of affection and love and like admiration, not just for his abilities as an artist and a creative, but also just for as Sam as a character, and just like how he was as a human being. And I wondered what aspects of him as a person were it that I think has led to this huge lasting impact on those whose lives he was a part of. I guess we can hear it through the songs, but we might not necessarily know character-wise what it was. I'd love to know if any of you have any like stories or aspects of what it was about him that made him so lovable and memorable.
I think there's many sides to him, like I think there is to us all sometimes. I think there's a side to him that he was really determined to push the boundaries in terms of what he was creating, for sure. Also, he was a little bit like, there was people that said he was a bit scary. He wasn't. He was just like a big soft teddy bear underneath all of that. And I think that fronting came from him. The racism in the late 60s, early 70s, which was really horrific. But I think he just as a human being, he had a massive heart, and it comes from, I think, our dad, because our dad was, I wouldn't say that he was your typical Bangladeshi dad, your Bengali dad. He wasn't particularly religious. He was a practicing homeopath and had been for a long time. So our influences really came from nature, came through things like classical homeopathy, and just this need to, and a constant encouragement to do what made us happy. And I think that those influences for sure came onto all of us. But for Sam, Arun's personality was that he was always encompassing different kinds of people and different kinds of musicians. And we very much grew up around his house with, it wasn't unusual for us to all turn up and there'd be 50 people in front of him and he'd give everyone an instrument. And we'd all sit in a circle and it'd be just like a massive jam. That wasn't an unusual thing for us growing up. Certainly for me and my little brother Dida, that was like an every Saturday thing for us. I was 14, I had to turn up with my violin and he'd force me to play it. And even if it sounded shit, he'd still make me play it. I mean, that was just the way he was. But I think outside of him being a musician, he was just a really lovely, lovely human being. And also at the same time, if he thought you was chatting shit, he'd tell you was chatting shit. He wouldn't mince his words, so to speak. He thought, but at the same time, if he thought you was doing something amazing, he'd say you're doing amazing, or this is amazing. So he always really came from his heart and truth. And I think that's what really, you know, you either liked him or you didn't like him, and there was a lot of people that didn't like him. And sometimes even I didn't like him, and I'm his little sister, but that's all right, you know, I'm allowed to. But he was just a larger than life, you know, for want of a better phrase. He was just that sort of character. And after he passed away, I was getting phone calls and messages and emails from many years after saying he did this for me, and I was like, I don't even know who you are. You know, that I was constantly having these stories of this is how amazing he was, this is what he did for me. You know, he helped me, I was homeless, he housed me, he fed me, he gave me this, he gave me that. And I was like, great, so that has influenced my art in some ways, where I've had to hold the space of like a broken heart, but also this beauty. So it's sat, and so there's a few pieces that I've created which speaks to that space of feeling broken but feeling very beautiful, because all these people are saying, your brother was amazing. And I was like, he's a pain in the arse, but they were like, he's amazing. So I was constantly being like thrown lots of beauty about him, but at the same time feeling very broken. And so that experience has come through some of my pieces of work.
So yeah, that was another really lovely thing to find out through doing the research about. Just like he was really involved in a lot of like, you know, community focused like teaching and workshops and that sort of thing. Which I know, Lucy, you said you also do a lot of teaching as well. And so I think it's because I think it's essentially like a form of art in motion. And I was just wondering if like your background as a visual artist has sort of informed your approach to teaching yoga as well, and if there's been like I guess as sort of multidisciplinary things do naturally feed into each other, but I guess those two things specifically, whether they take inspiration as like a two-way path, yoga and your sort of like initiative visual art.
Yeah, they do. I actually did my degree in performing arts, so I think because I spent a lot of my sort of between 14 upwards with Sam, going from one gig to the other where he would play and he'd say, don't leave my eyes, make sure I can see you, and I would just spend the entire time jumping around like a nutcase. So by the time I left school with nothing, with no GCSEs because I hated it, it was really complicated, our childhood. I went and did something at college for a year, failed that, but then I went and did an audition for a performing arts course and I got in. And I did that for 2 years, and then I went off and did a degree, and then I ended up specialising in movement. So I'd always come with this immense love for movement and dancing. So I sort of found yoga really as a healing space because of losing my brother. And then I sort of found that I was able to change the yoga and reshape it to make it accessible to my body and to move in a way that brought me like sheer beauty and peace in a way that I hadn't really experienced for a long time. And I think when your heart is sitting in deep grief, you know, I craved it, I wanted it. So that's where it comes. So that's why I do it.
Yeah.
And also I smoked for a really long time and I stopped smoking. And I replaced the yoga with the smoking, and it's been great. I've not had a fag for 6 years.
And I think the experiences with the show, like, if you had any, like, I think my understanding of the show is quite limited, so I don't know if it was like what the reception was like versus like for the typical British audience versus how the South Asian community was maybe like receptive to it. Like with regards to Easter Night, how did that sort of come across? And was it positive? Was it like, why are they doing this?
I think it was weird and wonderful at the same time because we hadn't had that level of representation. So to see anyone brown on the telly, it was like, oh my God, they've done it.
Awesome.
You know. That's all I can really say about Easter Night. Also, I just love Goodness Gracious Me. So if you've not seen it, hunt me down, go and watch it because it was pivotal in our history for like brown people for sure. But yeah, that's
Yeah, it's mostly just like the show that are spotlighted and shouted about and have stood the test of time are the Punjabi ones.
yes,
But it's like, for me, it was the more that I delved deeper into the Asian underground, it was outside of the, you know, the characters that are spoken about, you know, your Talbins, your Nitins, your Bali Sagus, etc. The level of Bengali achievement and influence on the entire scene, and how like integral it was through people like Sam, through Joy, through Asian Dub Foundation, all of these incredible artists that were spurring the scene alongside, you know, the Punjabi community as well. For me, it was crazy to discover it again through the Bengali lens and suddenly become so much more personally in touch with it. And it's, for me, this sort of thing is so important because it makes sure that we continually highlight the fact that there are so many incredible Bengali artists and Bangladeshi artists that have like either, you know, spurred entire movements or inspired countless people, but are never really necessarily given their flowers. And hopefully we can maybe add like one flower today as well to people like Sam's bouquet, which is continually being given, I think, now as well, as more and more people sort of start to understand the influence that he's had, and I'm sure the influence that he's had on many other people as well. So it's nice to sort of have a bit more of a connection with just people that I've also found as an inspiration. So yeah, again, thanks to yourself and you all for being part of this panel. Nice. So we, so I think moving on to about halfway through, it's all good. So if we move on to sort of like individual artist questions about like there was a lot of, like you said, the familial inspiration was sort of, I can imagine it's been like bouncing off each other constantly in such like a creative household. But yeah, was it very much like mostly based around that, or were there other sort of external influences that were happening either throughout the Asian underground scene or sort of beyond?
It was mainly through Sam. I don't call him Sam, I call him Arun, which was his home name. Sam was a name that he used in the 70s because all of that shit around fucking navigating white people.
No one can say Arun.
Yeah.
It's too difficult.
But like, his home name was Arun. My dad chose names very related to the time we were born. So he was born in the morning and he named him Arun, which means sunrise. So he was like my dad, and my dad was like my best mate. So he was very encouraging, and so he was constantly telling me to create. Don't give a fuck about what anyone else thinks. Just put your stuff out there. And for years I didn't do that because I just had so much anxiety, I suppose, around not feeling internally worth enough. And then it was only until about 4 years after he passed away that I thought, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. So then I started just putting stuff out there. But a lot of the influence really came from him. And then growing up in an extremely creative environment, like I was forced to play the violin by my dad because he was desperate for us to learn an instrument, and I hated it because the teacher was really horrible. But I think that when you're around an environment which is constantly about creating music, creating, I think it embeds itself really in my fashion, and that's where it's come from. So I didn't really look outside. It most definitely came from Arun and my dad, I would say.
Amazing.
I feel like if like I don't make something or build something, so I sort of work with a lot of hand-drawn images, and then I'll build a digital image. Like, so if I don't make something or draw something, or if I haven't done a class, or if I haven't, I don't feel whole. So I think it's like something that I call like a rainbow of things that I do. So it's called a rainbow of activities, and each colour is a different activity, and I often have to do this so that I feel well. So it's really, for me, it's about how do I maintain being well. Yeah. And that involves making stuff. I cook a lot. I do a lot of yoga, and we have constantly music in our house. So those things are quite important. My art came a little bit later, but looking back on it, so I've actually been making things. I don't really call myself an artist, I call myself a maker. I make things because I feel like making stuff with my hands is part of my recovery, which is loaded and layered with lots of other things. But I think a lot of my drawings is around flowers along roots. My home name, my duck name is Parul, and my dad said, again, just going back to our dads, he said that when I was born past midnight, and he held me up in the light in like Dhaka, and he said that I looked like this flower called Parul. So then it took me about 30 years to realise why I kept drawing all these flowers with really long roots that were like deeply interconnected and constantly revolving. So that's where my art initially sort of comes from, really, in terms of its core starting point. And then it's just changed and developed, and I've been making tutus, which is really fun. And then sort of more recently I've been making yoga mat bags made out of tweed and vintage starry that belonged to my mother. So yeah, I'm sort of coming from a place of wanting to make things because I'm looking at it as like a way of being well and keeping well. So yeah, so there's
Amazing,
like
yeah.
So there's a little bit of a link there with the family.
Amazing. So I guess like also following on from that, sort of reading about Sam and his journey through his artistic practice, and like in sort of, I don't know if it's 100% true, but sort of finding out that State of Bengal was, as an idea, was basically born from a trip back to North Ali. And like I just was interested about maybe the journey that he had with regards to like going back home, obviously like living in Ankara and Amman and then Dhaka, how the journeys, and then like what was it about that trip that you might know that actually spurred the inspiration to then make State of Bengal as a project?
I think State of Bengal is again, it's layered like with many of us. There's so many things, but from my memory, the central thing around his work was really his experience of racism, and how that impacted upon him. And this gap that we have, these spaces of not knowing our history or our culture because we're here. So I think that really, for me, as his sister, was really one of the things that I thought was quite like a solid foundation for him to really use this space as a creative way to produce music, some would say ahead of its time, certainly, which I've only realised through people like Ashura Pereira, who's here today, who's been running something called Mishti Dance, which he named after a track that was produced by State of Bengal. But I think it's really difficult to actually say exactly what it was, but I know that his trips to Bangladesh were certainly pivotal, were certainly influential. But I think there's so many spaces in terms of our experience of being, like, the second generation and like the experience of racism and the onslaught of that and what that actually meant, that I think it's only natural and normal for me and for him to go, how to really move this in a way which is about creating and expression.
Thanks so much. And yeah, I just wonder what, have you had sort of like similar experiences with regards to